Okay, it is 12:02. I think we'll get started here. Let me throw it over to Meredith. Do you want to kick us off?
Let's have Ellen do some intros here, and then we'll get the conversation going.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I know some folks are from around the world. Looks like somebody's from Brazil. My name is Ellen Chang. I'm part of BMNT. This webinar is sponsored by Ahrefs Labs. It's a deep tech accelerator that works with a variety of different types of technology founders. And we've been really pushing heavily around space and the blue economy and the clean energy. But essentially, we marketed to a very wide range of folks. Several folks have messaged us and can't join live, so they're going to get the recording here. And we hope to continue the conversation on Slack. So look for some information about that towards the end of this webinar. What I wanted to say is, why am I pulling together this topic about storytelling, and why is it relevant to your personal stories, your company stories, and also if you're raising money, why that's important? Because storytelling is all about what you're building. And so I've invited Amy Chang, who's an investor. We've been investing together for 7 or more years now, very astute and has lots of experience talking to founders. We have Ed Williams, who's a brand strategist, worked at a big brand firm, Gerber, and which really has deep experience there. And then Meredith Ingram, who's a marketing, PR, and communications guru, worked in New York, has a New York agency background, the top of the top. And these folks are going to give you some words of wisdom. I really want to invite all of you to not be shy on the Q&A. This is for you. So make it about you. With that, I'm not going to be moderating. I'm going to turn it over to Meredith Schweitzer. She's an excellent moderator. She's going to be bringing you all into the conversation as we move forward. So with that, Meredith, turning it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Meredith Schweitzer. I work for the Riot Mind Agency. We're an integrated communications agency. I'm a partner in crime with Meredith Ingram, your panelist here today. And what we're going to do is kind of walk through a pretty wide range of topics. So I want to get right into it, and to give some framework to who's who and what we're bringing to the conversation, I'd love to have each of the panelists introduce yourself, tell us maybe one line about your company, and give us one word of wisdom just off the bat. And we'll start with Amy, then we'll go Ed, then we'll go Meredith, and we'll come back to me. So Amy, do you want to take it?
Yeah, hi, I'm Amy Chang. I was the former head of strategy and investor relations for a publicly traded company here in San Diego. And I, at some point, I've made investments in 50 different startup companies. And so I've seen a whole lot of pitches. I have co-invested with Ellen before, and we're both members of the New Fund Venture Group. So I'm one of the board members. We're the largest angel network here in Southern California with over 300 members. And so it's great to be here today. My one words of wisdom is actually a question, which is, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, are you sure you're ready? Because it's a very long, hard, difficult road. It's definitely a marathon and a journey. And so just be sure what you're getting yourself into, because it is not easy to be an entrepreneur.
I'd love to hear in the chat people who consider themselves that are here today that consider themselves an entrepreneur, or sort of where you're at in your business, to get some understanding of who we're talking to as well. So Ed, why don't you introduce yourself while people are putting that in the chat?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Edward Williams. I'm the creative director at Money Design LLC. I've been doing graphic design and packaging and project management for about 20 years. I specialize in logo design and WordPress web design. I've been assisting startups and large corporations with these facets. I'd probably say the important factors I would communicate is, researching your target audience. Branding is not just about a good looking logo or a functional website. Your value from your customer comes from solving customer pain points and then addressing and satisfying those needs. Success is a roller coaster. There's going to be ups and downs. You don't know where the turns are coming from. But remember, with a roller coaster, at the end, you always feel exhilarated. So, there, I think, are pluses to it. And your number one competitor, at least for myself, is yourself. Be better than the day you were before. I think it resonates.
I think Ed is a motivational speaker on this. I love that. Your only competitor is yourself. I love that. It's true. It's true, though. Meredith, you want to introduce yourself and give a word of wisdom?
Sure. Like Ellen said, I come from an agency background, global PR and IR agencies. I actually started out as a Dow Jones reporter covering the capital markets. I have about 25 years of experience in PR, comms, and marketing strategy, supporting organizations from startups to multinationals. In 2012, I founded the Riot Mind Agency, which specializes in PR, comms, and marketing for space and deep tech organizations in particular, including the Air Force Research Lab, NASA, and a wide range of space and deep tech startups. My one piece of advice is that no matter how dry and technical your business is, use data-driven, human-centered narratives and kind of try to bring those things together. It sounds contradictory, but it's really that idea of that right brain, left brain convergence, and that will help kind of round your narrative out. And that's it.
Well, I think we can just dive right into the questions here. What we're going to do is spend about 40 minutes or so on about 30 minutes now on questions. And then we are hoping that you all will put quite a few questions in the Q&A. If you're in the chat, feel free to talk to each other there. But if you have a question that you want the panelists to address, I'll be monitoring those as well as Donna and Ellen. And we'll really try to focus on those towards the latter third of the program. Let's kick it off with Amy. Amy, I'd love to know, having worked with so many entrepreneurs, so many founders, what sort of, when you're getting a pitch, what catches your attention and what do you really look for in a founder?
So when somebody is pitching, I can tell you that there are certain questions in the back of the investor's mind that we're looking for answers, right? So one is we're trying to figure out, have you been an entrepreneur before? Have you had any previous successful exits? It always surprises me when I watch someone practice pitch and then, at the end, they finally reveal that they had a successful outcome somewhere else. And I'm sort of like, no, that should be your lead sentence, right? Which is that hi, I'm so-and-so, and I successfully did this other thing and I had a successful, exit. I mean, that literally should be the first thing that you say, because investors love a track record of success. So when we hear that, we'll literally stop emailing on our phone, put it down, and then start paying attention, right? So, that's always super helpful if you have that as a background. But the other questions that we're always trying to figure out are, do you already have revenue traction? Because revenue traction is a big indicator of product market fit. We're trying to figure out, is your product ready for sale? So, if you're a tech company, did you actually already build your tech, or is this just a back of the napkin, kind of idea and you're raising money to go build it, or is it already built, right? So we're always trying to figure out where are you at in terms of, your product being ready? Do you already have sales? So that's an indicator of product market fit. I'd say those are probably the most important. Also, the other two, is this something that's of market size magnitude that's going to, be big enough to make a difference? And then finally, why is your product, different? Why would it stand out from, all other products or substitutes that already, exist? So those are things that are kind of in the back of our mind, and we're literally waiting for you to flip through your slides and get to, each of those. Oh, the other thing, I think you said, what do you look for in a founder?
Yeah.
The founder is probably one of the most important things in terms of trying to decide whether or not to invest in something. And we actually, oftentimes we watch founders for a very long time. We watch them from a distance. And so, you may be pitching somewhere, we see you, we're listening to what you're saying and what you say your milestones are. The next time we see your pitch, We're listening to see if you actually met those milestones that you talked about last time. So we're looking to see how much progress you're making. We may have coffee with you a number of times because we're trying to get to know you. Personally, there are 3 things that I look for in a founder, and I would say it's always the founder first. The founder is always the most important thing. The first thing I look for is integrity. So I want to know that this person always acts with integrity. I literally just will not do business with people who I perceive as being just bad actors.
Yeah.
The second is grit. And then the third is business acumen. The reason why it's in that order is because being an entrepreneur is so hard, and it's such a difficult thing to do, and it's so stressful that I need to see that you have grit, that you're going to be able to take this all the way, right? Because if I'm going to write you a check, right, I want to see that you're not going to quit halfway through. And even when there's co-founders, like, we're trying to figure out, but who's the real founder? Like, if there's 2 co-founders and one of them dies, like, does the other one care enough to continue to take the ball and run, right? Or are you like the pseudo co-founder that, like, if the other one dies, like, the whole thing is just going to go away, right? Like, that's how much grit matters, is we're trying to figure out even who's the one who's actually going to hang in there. And then third is business acumen. I mean, you have to be smart enough to know how to pivot and make money. But it's literally in that order, because there are a lot of people in the world who have business acumen, but they have no business being an entrepreneur because they either lack integrity or they lack grit.
So, it's so great to have that kind of structure of, like, facts first. Don't bury the lead when you're working with people. Tell the story up front, and that the way you outline, like, which pieces are coming from the founder. I think that's really going to dovetail to some of the advice that Ed and Meredith have as well around authenticity and sort of how you tell your why and how you find your center. So thank you so much for that answer, Amy. I think that was incredibly helpful, and there were some really good words of wisdom in there. Ed, I'd love to hand it to you to kind of follow up on that. In Amy's summary, she's talking about having that business acumen, being able to identify what's your core differentiator, those kinds of things that are very central to branding and to your corporate identity. And you've done so much work in that realm of brand strategy and corporate narrative development. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the structure that you have in working with organizations? And you have this wonderful kind of 10-step points that I'd love you to get into, if you can talk about that.
Sure, absolutely. So, I guess let's just kind of talk about, what kind of makes brands successful. The obvious thing is, prioritizing visuals, right? So a recognizable brand that has attention-grabbing graphics that creates strong visual associations, provides you kind of an improved recognition. You see that with, Coca-Cola, Nike, Amazon. These are brands that have iconic graphics that are easily recognizable, which leads you to have kind of a clear brand identity. So, strong branding that embodies visually compelling presentation, but the key to that is the consistency, right? The consistency in your messaging across the board. How do you talk to your audience, in your target audience, to determine what that brand is immediately? In that, talking about your target audience, it's understanding how to define that. Who is your consumer? Who are you speaking to? Who are you trying to attract? And then, developing long-term relationships with that target demographic that you've identified, and kind of prioritizing long-term relationships over maybe short-term sales. I think successful brands are about retaining clients, and also understanding the value of meeting customers' emotional needs. What are the needs that you're addressing with your target audience that you can help address? Kind of how can you innovate to better serve that audience? If you can innovate to serve that audience, then you're addressing those consumer needs. You also then focus on the excellence, right? So If you're focusing on the excellence, then that drives your growth. If you focus on building powerful and engaging stories that meet customer needs, if you focus on building powerful, engaging stories that meet customer needs, excuse me. If you
All right,
focus,
you're losing the thread. You want to start it out, you're in the middle there. You want to start that thought over? Oh, now you're muted.
You're muted.
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I was talking about focusing on the excellence, right? And
Yeah.
growth, focusing on
Yeah.
the excellence and the output of that product growth.
Yeah.
And then kind of understanding your social media engagement. You know, at this day and age, most people actually only focus on social media. They actually engage in branding via social media. So how do you leverage that? How do you leverage that target audience to gain helpful insights to understand those consumer needs for kind of continuous improvement? So your marketing strategies would play into that to kind of help generate leads, to foster brand loyalty in terms of like understanding that social engagement. You want to honor and fulfill your commitment to your consumers. So what is your brand promise? What does your company stand for? What does it believe in? The vision that you have for your company, how does that impact and resonate with the world? Those are things in terms of your brand promise that allow you to fulfill with your consumer. And then again, what she was just talking about, having a clear and concise business model. A clear and concise business model allows you to kind of, deliver and understand what you're talking about. So all strong brands kind of understand who they are and what they need to deliver. Creating processes and standards, you need to create processes and standards that help you achieve that in terms of your business models. And that is driven by understanding your target audience and learning their needs, values, and pain points. And those are the 10 things that I would kind of outline to kind of help them with that.
Yeah, that point to understanding your target audience, I think, cannot be stressed enough. Before we sort of go to Meredith with the next question, I'd be curious, Amy, when you're first talking with companies, I heard you say, that you've maybe been already following the founders a little bit. In those initial kind of conversations, where do you find that brand promise, or like the who you are and your gut and your values? Should that lead, or should that go behind the data? There's a place for kind of like, we believe in this, and this is the change we see in the world. And I think Meredith and I have kind of opinions on where that lands in when you present yourself. But on the investor side, I'm really curious, is that like, give me your data first, and then tell me about how you believe in XYZ? Help me with that.
So one thing I will say is that when you're an angel investor, right, which is different than a venture capitalist, when you're an angel investor, that means you're an individual person who writes checks on the much smaller side than a VC would. And because we're, a human being just like everybody else, I will tell you that there is an emotional connection that has to exist to be interested enough to want to be behind this person or founder in what they're trying to do. And so in that regard, whatever their mission is, whatever their impact is that they're trying to, make a difference in the world, we do want to hear, what that is. And that's not always numbers driven, right? So,
Right.
Literally one of the best pitches I ever heard was a medical device because a pre-med student was volunteering at the VA hospital, and a veteran was in so much pain that he shot his own leg off. And so this founder felt like, wow, I didn't do enough for this veteran. And he actually dropped out of medical school, which pissed off his parents. And then he went and he learned how to code, and he learned how to be an engineer. And he actually created a device that uses, it's called axon therapy, but it's like some kind of magnet, or anyway, it uses some kind of, frequency, right, that you can apply to a person to reduce their pain. And, to me, that is one of the most compelling stories that I've ever heard, because, when I think about the amount of money that I've, invested in this company. Of course, I want a return on investment, but to be honest with you, when a person is in that much pain, to alleviate that pain is sort of priceless, right? And so in my mind, like if it alleviates the pain, in some other human being that's like suffering that much, it was already worth it, right? Just from a human perspective. And so, he still had to have all the other fundamentals, right? Which is a working product, a certain number of patients that it worked on, like, software that supports it, a team, other investors. So there are a lot of things, and he was starting to make strides getting FDA, clearance, right? So there were still a million other things that he had to do for the person to think that this is a viable, product that is compelling, right? But in terms of but there's a whole bunch of those, right? But the story made it stand out, and it made, me as an individual want to get behind him and, be a part of this, thing that he's trying to create. So that's why I would say that, yeah, the data matters a lot. The, potential for success, the practical potential for success, the future margins, the operating model, what's your go-to market strategy? All of that matters, right? But in my mind, does the branding matter on this? And not so much, right? But the story mattered a lot. So, so I love data, but sometimes emotion matters too.
It's huge. And I think what you're pointing to, that's part of what we're hoping to get across to people today, is that there is a reason why you started your company. There's a reason why you're doing what you're doing. And you've got to really, especially if the founder is leading the charge, that founder really needs to understand that pivot point, that catalyst that enabled the leap to decide to have the business in the first place. And I think that what's really interesting about the example you share is that it's personally emotional, but there's also that narrative projection that you're using so that you're able to connect your story and your experience to the end user, to the investor, to the audiences. You're not telling a solely internal story. You're really leading with what I think Meredith is going to talk some about, which is empathy, which is really like getting that human connection into the conversation. So Meredith, I'd love to get you in the conversation here. And maybe we can start with sort of how the Right Mind Agency helps companies tell their story. And in this context of strategic storytelling, just talk to us about how you work with companies and really where you direct people in the process.
Yeah, I want to start the conversation in a maybe a little bit more specific place than going broad. And this weaves into how we work with companies, certainly. But I want to emphasize the value of the market research that you're getting into the investor mindset through Amy's insights here, because this is exactly the kind of audience insights that you need to have. And really one of the only ways to do it is to actually talk to those audience members, because she's been very explicit about the things that she wants to hear about. That I want the exit history. I want to know, what your, whether you're revenue positive right now or not, what your plan to get there is. I mean, she's been very, very specific. And those kinds of insights are absolutely invaluable. And they're really hard to know if you're not actually talking to your audience. So I think that's one of the first things that I would emphasize. I think a lot of what I want to talk about has a little bit more to do with the tactical development of your story. We think of things modularly. So for instance, if you're taking into account, what Amy has said, you're talking about your origins, you're talking about the competitive landscape, you're talking about your business model, and all of these pieces are parts of a bigger whole. And so I think one of the things you want to think about as you're developing that story is, what does that whole look like from start to finish? Flesh that out, make sure it's modular so that you can, once you know who you're talking to and how much they know about what you do and about your business, or what level of background they need, you can kind of pull those modules down and use them, and customize them essentially for the information that your audience needs to hear from you. And so I think that's, one of the key things. Going back to what Amy and Ed were saying earlier, the data is important, the business model is important, but people like to feel part of something bigger. And when Amy's talking about, that founder that she was investing in, that's what I hear is, that was an opportunity to be part of something much, much bigger than, one individual founder. And if you can build that into your entire narrative, then you can really pull people along at an emotional level that's connective and memorable. Because Amy, I don't know how long ago that was, but I have a feeling that wasn't necessarily recent, and you still remember it with so much clarity that you can retell it now, and that's something you cannot put a price on. So
I think that point of understanding how to make that empathetic connection is really critical. And I'd be curious from Ed, people tend to go so kind of tactical in what they should be doing. And I'm interested to know how you think about approaching brand strategy without your founders getting into the tactics of how many posts do I need to do on LinkedIn and how many this do I need to do. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you really want to kind of engage and create a memorable experience. And we were kind of talking about this earlier in terms of, building long-term relationships. I'm kind of very process driven and consumer service driven. Right. So creating that intimate experience with your consumer, I think it's important in building that relationship with consumers. That helps elevate your brand. It helps resonate with your consumers, and it helps with retention. You want to kind of move towards longevity. Right. So if you're able to kind of speak to that consumer centric aspect, you create that memorable emotional connection that Amy, and Meredith were talking about, where you can kind of leverage that communication or, that relationship with your consumer and your brand.
Meredith, how do you get people started in this process, in the process of that? I mean, we talk all the time about how, founders love to talk about what their tech does, not why they're doing it, talk to us about how you get people or give some help to some of the founders on the call here about how you even get started storytelling when you've been so consumed with
with the real world,
what my sensors can do, data wise,
right.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's this does get really tactical and kind of in the weeds, but just the overview is, we really see it as two parts. There's the kind of the pre-storytelling work, that foundational work that has to happen before you can even get to a narrative, right? So that's, what are your business objectives? I mean, everything should center around your business objectives. What are you trying to accomplish from a business growth perspective? That can be, fundraising, that can be sales, it can be building visibility and reputation in advance of wanting to attempt an exit. So what are the business objectives? We've talked a lot already about who the audiences are, what do they need to hear to pull those levers, and where do you find them? And I think that's another piece of, kind of certainly what we consider. The competitive landscape should really play a big role in your narrative. Who are you trying to displace, and how are you going to do that? And you cannot say we don't have competitors. We hear that all the time. There's no one doing what we do. I'm sure Amy's heard it a million times. You have to consider the competitive landscape. It also helps you figure out not just to understand who your competitors are and what they're doing, but then how do you position to be different and stand out, in that landscape? And how do you stack up? What's a realistic, assessment of where you live relative to what they're doing? Integrating all of that with your brand identity is really important. So like Ed said, you know, core values, brand vision, brand promise, founder origins. I mean, that, you know, at the heart of any company are people. And I think that gets lost. You know, your story, your inspiration is absolutely critical to making your narrative memorable. Especially if it's something as compelling as the story that Amy told. I remember, you know, there was an organization, Meredith, you'll probably remember this, that we worked with, that we had been working with for a few months before we found out that the founder of the organization had actually been inspired originally in their entire professional trajectory by their experience growing up in New York City projects. And I could not believe that we were, you know, this far into the project and that had never been mentioned. Not only had it never been mentioned, but it wasn't in any collateral or any communications that they'd had that we'd seen previously. It was nowhere. And so that felt like such a missed opportunity. I mean, we were able to, you know, circle back on it and weave it in. But what was interesting is even after we did that, I'm not sure the organization still understood exactly how potent that line is, you know, that origin. They just kind of seem to maybe whitewash it out of the history and not, you know, not really recognize its resonance. And so I found that really interesting. So I think you've got to be careful that you really understand what will connect with people. And then the last part of that is, you know, kind of building all of that together to come up with messaging that's actually going to move the needle with your audiences. So that's kind of the pre-work. And then, you know, once you've got all of that synthesized, then you can start to build your narrative. And the narrative for us kind of comes down to 7 key parts. Number 1, I talked about already, you know, you want to make sure it's comprehensive and it's modular. So the structure of it is really important so that you can pull pieces down as you need them and customize those for the people you're talking to. The complexity of it is really critical as well. This is especially important if you're a tech founder. You know, we talk to founders all the time who say, we encourage them to use plain English. And they're like, I don't want to dumb this down. The tech is incredible. We get it. We know that, you know, you don't want to undersell it, but it's got to be understandable. And there are plenty of VCs, for instance, that we've talked to who will tell you, I hear tons of, you know, pitches. I hear tons of tech. And I don't understand all of the intricacies of your technology. You do need to make it clear. So the guideline that we use is Wall Street Journal level. It's about 11th grade, you know, reading level. It's a really good standard. If it's good enough for the journal, it's probably good enough for your narrative. Relevance, use data, give context for how you fit into the broader world. The connectivity piece of it, the audience, you know, solving the audience problem is really important, as well as providing the inspiration, that big vision, and humanizing your story so that there's, you know, you want to bring it back to what's the real impact on real people right now. So that's kind of the, you know, the not so short version of how we think about structuring a narrative.
And the structure of that narrative, there's 2 points in there that I want to reinforce that I think are really important to hear. And one is about authenticity, which we've all kind of been talking about, which is that story of the founder from the Bronx. You know, you have to get comfortable with your own story. And if you're not comfortable with your why and your how, you better get comfortable, because the Amy's of the world are going to be peppering you with understanding what that why is. And they're not asking you once, they're going to ask you again and again and again. If that why changes, to Amy's point of integrity, you know, that's going to call in some questions of integrity or questions of why motivations and things like that. So really getting comfortable with your why, I think, is really critical. And the other thing that is important, I think, to hear in the framework that Meredith just outlined is that repetition is not boring. Repetition is reinforcing. So if an Amy of the world is watching you over time and watching your company grow, that's one circumstance, but it's more likely that people are engaging with your company, you know, this is the first time or the second or the third, maybe, you know, and so that having that that message that you're reinforcing of what you're doing, who you are, and how you're executing the change that you want to see in the world, reinforcing that, again, not boring. It just gets you a more concrete version of yourself. I see we have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I know, Amy, you've been answering some. I don't know if Ed or Meredith, you've been popping in to answer some, but I'd love to get over there. Before we get to Q&A, actually, no, let's just go to Q&A. A lot of these have to do with pitching specifically. So Amy, it seems like you've answered some of those. Is there anything in the ones that you've typed out answers that you want to share with the larger group here?
Yeah, so, we had a couple of questions around like when the difference between like a pitch video and a, pitch deck, right? Like, is the content different? How should it be different? I would say in a pitch video, it should be the key points that matter the most in your pitch deck. Like, you would want to make those same key points, in your pitch video, right? And the reality is like, if you're at a pitch contest or on a pitch stage or at a demo day or something, pitching to a live audience, your slides would be flashing in the background anyway, right? And so in that regard, it's kind of like a combo pitch deck and video. One thing that I will mention is sometimes people put too much emphasis on cramming a lot of information into their pitch deck. And I would say that your strategy at that stage, when you're sending a pitch deck over to someone, it's not like, let's pretend we're playing golf and there's like you're trying to get the ball in the hole, but at that moment, you're not trying to get the ball in the hole. Okay. You're not ever going to win an investor over just by sending over a deck. Your goal is to get the first meeting with them, right? Like your goal is to get their attention and get them to get on the phone so that they can start to get to know you and, learn more. So just remember that, right? Like it's like a sales process in a sense. You have to give them enough compelling stuff to hook them to be willing to take your meeting. The other thing I will say is, because someone had mentioned that, hey, there's these like online platforms where I can create a profile and I should post a deck and a video. And, I agree, you should do all those things, but I will tell you that the thing that works the best in terms of getting in front of investor is like literally a warm introduction. And so that is definitely going to work the best. We get cold call, LinkedIn messages, emails, like all the time. And a lot of times you look at it and you're like, yeah, I don't really know this person, right? Like I don't know them from the guy that I got an email from yesterday, right? And so a warm introduction matters a lot. Like if Ellen sends me an email, I will most certainly reach out to the person. I may not invest, but at least I will talk to the person. And if I can be helpful, like even if it's not in my sweet spot of what I like to invest in, I'm at least probably willing, because they are a friend of Ellen's, to, like talk to the person. A lot of times they'll ask me for feedback on their pitch deck because I'm very transparent and I'm willing to give people really hard feedback. And I'm willing to tell them the stream of consciousness of what's going on inside an investor's head as I go through each page even, right? And a lot of investors are not willing to do that because a lot of them, they don't want to get blocked out of a deal later because they, accidentally offended the person. I take the opposite view. I take it as if I'm helpful to you by giving you honest feedback, like, you will find that valuable, right? And you'll want to continue to be connected with me. And if you're super offended, then I don't want to invest in you anyway, because you're not a coachable founder. So
you want to set people up for success, right?
Right.
And to set people up for success, they have to be able to take creative criticism, right?
100%, right.
And being, when you're doing entrepreneurial type stuff, you're going to have to, take maybe some lickings at some point.
Oh, you're going to take a ton. So I think that
that doesn't play into my motivational speaking.
I'm just saying that this is hard. You need to be very tough and thick-skinned and, be very coachable. But I will say networking makes a really big difference.
In fact, but before we got on today, when we were all in the green room, if you will, I think, Ed, it was you that said, if you're not on LinkedIn, like, what are we even doing here? Like, what's happening? So
Yeah,
the point of
it's just the
networking.
power of networking and reaching
Yeah.
out. And I mean, and to
Yeah.
leverage, what Amy was talking about. I mean, you really want to try and, your introduction is your kind of first impression to people, right? And that actually plays into your branding. Your branding, your local, right, is the first impression to people. Like your website is your first impression to people, so you want to present well in terms of those things. So, obviously that goes past, the pitching and stuff like that. But, these visuals are key kind of things that kind of will generate the interest to then drive your business.
Yeah.
So, there are things that you just need to pay attention to.
This whole, what I think what both of you are hitting on, and Meredith, you hit on as well, is that everyone you're talking to is a person, and it's helpful to think about it in like terms of dating. You wouldn't immediately ask someone to marry you, you'd want to like see if they'd go on a date, and like maybe your branding pulls them in and they can get to know you a little bit more, and maybe you can start a relationship and let it evolve over time. So I think that's a big part of storytelling for your brand as well.
Well, when you're doing social media marketing, right, you kind of do teases, right? Market
Yeah.
trailers and stuff. I mean, if you think of movies, right, they have teaser trailers to kind of get you interested into it, right? To ultimately get you to then go to the movie and buy the movie, right?
Right,
So
exactly.
you have
Meredith,
your
what were you-
layered.
Yeah.
I just want to add that in the context of, developing your messaging, which builds, into your narrative and your kind of your story overall, there's also flexibility. There should be kind of latitude to do A/B testing. I mean, you can iterate your story as well. So I think, the key is to be as smart as you can and as informed and knowledgeable as you can going into it, so that you can get into that kind of what I would think of as almost the sales pipeline, with, for instance, investors. But then to really pay attention to, as you're telling your story, and this is, I think, especially important for inception stage companies where it's hard to figure out what your story is. It really isn't. I think people think if they read a newspaper, if they know how to speak words, and they can use ChatGPT, they can probably tell a story. And it's really not that easy. It takes a lot of time, takes a lot of iteration. Sometimes you get it right and sometimes you don't. And I think paying attention to what's resonating with your audience, and then, going into that, leaning into that, can be really, really useful. And recognizing that it's all flexible, and it can evolve and should evolve as your company evolves.
And it has to evolve, right? Because I mean, I think the best brands evolve constantly because the needs of the consumers change sometimes, right? So, if your consumer needs change, then you have to evolve to address those needs of your consumer, right? To address your industry or whatever that might be.
Jeff has a good question in the Q&A that I think is going to be, I think I'd like to hear from each of you on, which is, Jeff says, you're providing great info on the strategy of storytelling. What guidance can you provide on actually drafting the copy? This is where my students frequently fail. They have a lot of great storytelling elements, and they don't know how to weave those into a clear, concise, compelling story. So, and he notes that, this is more about writing, but I think it's really applicable to this process of creating a deck or creating the messaging. So maybe Amy, you're nodding, so let's start with you. How would you respond there?
Yeah, because I've seen a lot of crappy decks. I used to be, I still am a strategy consultant, and I don't have to do this anymore, but when I was in my 20s, the way I would create a deck is you literally want to map out your deck, right? Like you make all the slides, you start by in the headers, like, all right, you create the organization of your slides, right? And then you start filling in the guts, right? And the whole thing in totality should come out to be, a compelling story. And you have to practice this a lot. Like this is an art form, right? But a lot of people are afraid to just start writing the deck. But sometimes you just got to put your ideas down on paper and then start massaging them and making sure that they're organized and like, okay, is it in the right order? Do I have the right level of detail on there? But the other thing that I would say that a lot of people miss, every single slide in your deck, in my opinion, should have what I'd call a so what, right? Like you can put data on the page, but if there's no so what, then why is that slide even in the deck, right? And so there's got to be a compelling point that you're trying to make for, you know, every piece in the deck. So that would just be my, like, you know, 2 cents. That's not going to get you to 100, right? Because it just takes a lot, like a lifetime of practice, actually.
Mhm.
And ask
So
for a
what
lot of
we-
feedback,
go ahead.
and then
Yeah,
be
ask for
coachable.
feedback. Ask for feedback is
Yeah,
huge.
and be
the-
coachable.
The so what test, Meredith and I use the so what test like probably 25 times a day. Well, let's go Meredith and then Edward, and I want to pop in before that and just say 2 points. One is that you know, in screenwriting, you often have a hero resist a journey 3 times before they accept it. So it's helpful in your storytelling, maybe with your students, Jeff, to really get people to think about, if you're the guide, what are the obstacles, what are the friction points, and be able to address those in the narrative. And that, in a way, for what we're talking about today, is very much about like, what are your customers' obstacles, and how do you become the guide to take them on the journey where you're taking them. So prompts like that might be helpful in terms of how to actually get words down on paper. So Meredith, let's do you, and then let's do Edward on how you'd approach that question.
You know, I have a lot to say on this. I think you're right, and you touched on it. You know, we always start with, again, I think the messaging, and there were all those things that I talked about earlier that go into figuring out, you know, what are you messaging? How are you messaging? But, you know, the thing that we start with when we're putting together the messaging, which is really the foundation for, you know, your full story, is what problem are you solving for the audience that you're talking about? And there can be a brand problem. You know, there's usually a problem you're solving at the brand level, and then there may be specific problems that you need to solve for with each stakeholder. But you always want to get centered on, what am I solving? And then I think Amy is, you know, so what, kind of reinforces that. So that's kind of number one. Number two is, I say this to my kids all the time: writing isn't writing, writing is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
You're thinking. And it's really important to think through the narrative that you're trying to tell at the outset. And I think Amy's point to just getting something down on paper is really important. The thing that we do, and Meredith, you know, I mean, you've heard me preach this a million times, whether it doesn't matter what we're writing, whether it's an article for a client or a deck, we start with a Word doc or a Google Doc, and we just do an outline. I am such a big proponent of do an outline first. It's always harder to, and keep it short. Like, do not, you know, 1 page. You should be able to get your entire deck's outline on a single page. And writing short is hard. Everybody, you know, I think maybe a lot of people don't know that, but writing short is hard. So that forces you to really make sure that everything you're saying is succinct and potent. And that's really important. And then you can kind of get, you know, you can see how the narrative flows if you're doing an outline first, and you can see how the last, you know, the next point builds on the last point, and you can see if it all makes sense, and how it feels. And then you can kind of move things around. I mean, we iterate in outline form. You know, that's, for me, that's 50% of any writing exercise.
I've been hounded by you directly about how to write an outline, so that's triggering me.
I'm sorry.
And how would you address like some of that in response to what
I would totally leverage everything that Meredith and Amy are saying. You know, again, kind of, you know, what do they call an elevator pitch, right? Like, how do you do an elevator pitch in 2 minutes, 3 minutes, right? You know, and sometimes you can do more with less. And I think that's the challenge, right? How can you still communicate with less, right? But then still communicate your full overarching structure of, like, you know, what am I trying to achieve here? You know, who's my target audience? Who's my target demographic? And, you know, I would recommend exactly what they said too, right? Kind of putting the list together, just getting things down on paper. You know, what I kind of do is the same process as them, is, you know, get stuff down on paper. It's going to evolve, it's going to change. But then when you get things down on paper, you can then start to realize how much you can actually pull out, right? But that only comes from actually when you get things down on paper, where you're just like, this is actually way too much. I'm actually presenting way too much. I need to actually just get into the nitty gritty of exactly what I need to communicate. And I can speak to this not necessarily from a pitching standpoint, but I guess a copywriting standpoint when you get into web development and search engine optimization and things of that nature where, copywriting is key, right? That's how you get your Google Analytics. That's how you drive traffic to your websites. So, the ability to write copy is actually critical. And part of writing that copy, I think, spins from what I think Amy was talking about, personal stories. Personal stories are things that resonate with people, where they can connect to you. So you want to have that kind of intimate experience with people. And that is driven by, the story that you write, which is within your copy framework. And again, just keep in mind, sometimes less is more. You don't want to inundate people with stuff. I think that's kind of the thing where people want to fit everything in. And then that can get overwhelming. I've worked on web projects where they're very heavy informational websites, right? So it's how do you retain the information in the website, but keep it engaging where it's not overpowering and it's doing too much, right? You still want it to be engaging, inviting, but then also give people the critical information like, okay, I need to understand what this business does and how they can help me.
We're going to get Ed back for a tutorial on how you should structure your website, because that is, oof, come on, people. We're getting
and Meredith, I want to just add one quick thing.
Sure.
One exercise I think that it's kind of a game I play with myself that I think could be helpful in terms of helping people figure out how they should think about how they actually write, when they're putting their narrative together. If you read any article, it's kind of, well, it's fun for, writing nerds. When you're reading the paragraph, each paragraph, what's the main point of each paragraph? There are a lot of words in an article, but there are only about 3 or 4 or 5 main points. And if you can reverse engineer, looking at pieces like that of copy and figuring out what's the main point, then it'll help inform you figuring out, okay, how do I get to my main point without writing, 200 words? What are the 7 words that really mean something here? And I think that's really what you want to try to accomplish initially.
I just want to echo that, because the last piece of advice I would give is that if you are talking to an investor and you only have 20 minutes of their time, and they said, all right, walk me through your deck, like the best slides you have in 10 minutes. And then I want to save 10 minutes for Q&A, like listen to the investor. Okay. Like they're being serious when they say that. And if you go over your 10 minutes, then you're not going to have time for a Q&A. And they already know in the back of their mind the questions that they want to ask you. And so you will not have any time to overcome the objections that are in their head about whether or not to proceed to another call. So I'm just saying, when they tell you what the time frame is, be respectful, and don't think that like, oh, I just, have all the time in the world. And so, when Meredith says, what are your key points? Like really stick to them and don't be like super long-winded and just go over time, because that's not respectful. And then they think that you're, a founder that doesn't have your act together and you can't adapt and you can't be agile. So that's my last 2 cents.
And I think you spoke to that, right, Amy, where it's like, if you already have the meeting, you're already halfway there, right? You're just actually really in the meeting to address any concerns they have left, right? The interest is already there. Otherwise you wouldn't be in the meeting. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, sometimes they want you to like give the overview, because they want to know what you think are the highest, like the 5 most important things to say. Like they want to hear it. Right. But you don't want to use up all of your time, like, talking about things that they don't really care about. Right. And they know some of the questions. So, just like when they say, here's how I want to carve up the time, like listen to them.
Well, and on that, I think that's a completely appropriate point to be sort of ending on, cognizant of our time, of everyone's time who's here today too. But I think one point to add there is practice. Practice. If you have 5 minutes, make a version of your story that's 5 minutes, make a version of your story that's 10 minutes, be able to adapt when you get in the meeting with Amy and you thought you had an hour and you have 15 minutes, you better be darn ready to talk about the 5 points that Meredith was talking about in a 5-minute version, instead of the hour. So practice is like huge, I think. Well, I want to take a minute and really thank everyone who had these great questions. I know we really didn't get to a lot of the questions, but thank God Amy was just like in there answering questions. So hopefully a lot of them got answered. You all have, you can look us all up on LinkedIn, and I don't know if Donna has our LinkedIn profiles handy. She can throw them in the chat, and if not, just look everyone up. You have our names, and that's probably the best way to get in touch with us. If you're a founder and you're not on LinkedIn, go get on LinkedIn right now and start being out front and center and start talking to people. If you want to get in touch with anyone on this call about how we can help you, let us know. And I really want to thank H4X Labs and BMNT for hosting the conversation. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to go to H4X Labs and get on their mailing list if you're not on the mailing list, so that you know when other conversations like this are happening, because really this is about reinforcing how to enable you to be successful in your efforts as an entrepreneur. So we're all about helping make that happen. And we're at the top of the hour. Again, thank you, everyone. I would love to hear one short sentence from each of you on your own takeaway from this conversation. Amy, go for it.
My own takeaway is probably, just based on what the others were talking about around, storytelling. I mean, I'm all about the numbers, but just hearing more, having a reminder about the importance, right, is very helpful for me.
Ed, what's yours?
I'm going to leverage something that Amy talked about earlier. I think being personable, right? I think that resonates with people, right? We talked about authenticity quite a bit, I think all three of us. And I think that's something that really helps not only with your pitch proposals, but when you actually get into your brand development and your website.
Meredith, what's yours?
This is, don't underestimate the complexity of this entire process. It's complex, it's time consuming, it's painful. And so I think you have to be okay with that. I also think I'm going to go back to the place I started, which is I think having very specific insights from your audience going into the process is really critical. Amy could literally tell you, like, here are the 5 things I need to know. And that can make or break whether that meeting goes your way or not. And so the more you can get those kind of insights, what are the questions you're going to want to ask me whenever we get to our meeting, whether that's with an investor or whether that's with a customer, is absolutely critical.
This has been an absolute delight. Thank you all so much for your engaging conversation, and hopefully we'll get everyone on this panel back for some other conversations in the future. Thanks, everyone, and you're free.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Bye.